In the small peaceful village Guozhuang, north of Zhoukou, a city in the central Chinese province of Henan, the usually uneventful lives of the villagers suddenly changed on the 19th of September in the year 2000. Two of the elderly local residents were found beaten to death in their home. Yang Peimin and Shan Lanying, who were both in their 70s, were sleeping when a man entered and bludgeoned them both to death. The intruder took what little cash he could find and disappeared into the wilderness of the surrounding countryside. The police had few clues as to the identity of the person who ended the lives of the old couple. The brutal slaying would remain unsolved for 3 years until the capture and arrest of New China's most feared and notorious criminal, the man referred to as the monster, Yang Xin Hai. The violent deaths of Yang Peimin and Shan Lanying marked the first time Yang Xin Hai took anyone's life, but it was only the start of his reign of terror across 4 provinces in China. In just under 3 years he would be responsible for numerous robberies, violations of both women and children, where he didn't discriminate between the living or dead, and the deaths of 67 people. Only 2 days after the incident in Guozhuang, Yang Xin Hai got off a bus in Zhumadian, a city only 100 kilometers from Zhoukou. Along the way he'd stolen a meter-long set of bolt cutters and intended to put them to ill use. To look less suspicious carrying the bolt cutters around, he stole a pile of firewood, slipped the cutters inside and made his way to another small village, this time in the township of Guanwangmiao. This time he targeted a small family-run village store. In rural Chinese villages it is common for some of the residents to use the front of their home as small convenience stores for the locals' daily needs. Yang Xin Hai believed that there was a guarantee of cash inside these small businesses. As he had done previously, he waited in the surrounding countryside for dark to fall and the village to drift off to sleep. He had already picked out his target, one that seemed to only be run by 2 women. He also knew from his own childhood, in small communities where everyone knew each other and much of the village were in some way related, people paid little attention to security. He waited until midnight, and the community of early rising farmers were long asleep, before making his way to his target. The window of the home was left open but covered by security bars. Yang Xin Hai used the bolt cutters to remove 2 of the bars, and entered. Any noise made hadn't woken the residents. He first looked in on the women who were sleeping soundly, then began to search for cash. At first he could only find the equivalent of $20, but refused to accept that was all. He wanted to search the room more thoroughly, but was concerned how much time it'd take. Picking up one of the bars he'd cut, he quietly approached the sleeping residents. The 3 residents were the 27-year-old homeowner, her 18-year-old sister, and a 4-year-old boy. He smashed each of them about the head with his makeshift weapon. However, the screams coming out of the home roused the doctor from a medical clinic next door. The doctor came running, flashlight in hand. He shined it on Yang Xin Hai, interrupting him mid one of his swings of the bar. Spooked, and now faced with someone prepared to fight back, Yang Xin Hai left the scene. The doctor tried to give chase, and at least get a good look at the attacker. His position as doctor took over. Knowing people had been hurt, he stopped, called an ambulance, and tended to the injured. Remarkably, the 3 victims survived the assault, and this would be the closest anyone would come to catching the monster. Yang Xin Hai escaped into the countryside once more, sleeping outside and stealing food from nearby farms to eat. Being interrupted and almost caught scared him, so he made the choice to leave Henan and made his way south to the neighboring province of Anhui. He arrived in Anhui in the city of Fuyang on October 1st. Somewhere along the way he'd gotten hold of a bicycle he was now using to get around. The fear of being caught he felt in Zhumadian had gone, and he was looking to strike again. In what would become a regular feature of his crimes, he chose not to do anything in the more prosperous city, feeling there was more chance of being caught. Instead he made his way into the rural backwaters looking for something that grabbed his attention. He stopped in a village named Xiaoying on seeing a 12-year-old girl playing with her younger brother. Yang Xin Hai watched the pair play until they went home. The monster had found his next target. The 12-year-old girl and her 7-year-old brother lived with their grandmother, who was 63 years of age. Yang Xin Hai easily entered the unlocked home at night, with a meter-long iron axle he'd found discarded in the village. He smashed the head of the grandmother and grandson, ending their lives, before going after the granddaughter. He beat her with the iron axle until there were no more signs of life, then truly earned his monster nickname by violating her post-mortem. He drifted into the countryside after satisfying his desires, and the next morning the 3 victims were found by a villager, who came to ask for some coal. When police were called, they managed to extract a DNA sample, but it would do little good until Yang Xin Hai was finally arrested years later. The monster at this time still feared being caught. He spent little time in built-up urban areas to avoid any interaction with the police. Instead, he lived rough in the countryside, bedding down in any place that provided any sort of shelter, and stealing food from farms to sustain him. His concern was unnecessary. He wasn't on the authorities' radar at all. As he had no job, didn't register an address, he was effectively a ghost. After the incident in Fuyang, he wouldn't make his presence felt again until 9 months later, back in his home province of Henan. In the August of 2001, he was in the city of Luohe, around 70 kilometers north of the scene of his first major crime, Zhumadian. On the 15th of that month, he rode a newly stolen bicycle to a remote village in the township of Juling. There he quickly picked out a target, a 43-year-old woman who lived with her 11-year-old son and 14-year-old daughter. He looked around the village for a makeshift weapon, and settled on a large iron rod he found lying around, then waited for nightfall. This time he was also carrying a fruit knife. He silently snuck into the home of the woman and her 2 children, and immediately attacked the mother while she slept, beating the life out of her with a steel rod. He did the same to her young son, leaving the daughter till last. In minutes the lives of the 3 occupants of the house were extinguished, but Yang Xin Hai wasn't finished. He violated the corpses of the mother and daughter, then cut the throats of the 3 victims to ensure they were all dead. There wasn't any attempt to search the home for money, he just took whatever small amount the woman had in her pocket. He disappeared into the countryside once again, to continue his life as a drifter. The bodies were discovered the next morning. The police were called and an investigation began. Hair and semen samples were taken and police managed to produce a DNA profile of the perpetrator. The entire population of the village had to give blood samples for testing, but it gave the police no clues about the person they wanted. Yang Xin Hai had gotten away with another brutal, horrific attack. The attack in Juling took the monster's dead victim count up to 8. However, none of his crimes had yet been linked, and the fears Yang Xin Hai felt about the police coming for him began to fade. With growing confidence, he started using his crimes as a way for him to vent his anger for any minor issue or inconvenience that bothered him. He never dared to confront the person who troubled him directly. Once his anger built up, he would go looking for someone else to punish. An example of this happened only a month after his previous attack. Back in the city of Zhoukou, the area where he took someone's life for the first time, he boarded a bus with no real plan on where he would head next. Getting an empty window seat cheered his mood. That changed when an old woman sat on the seat next to him. He was disgusted that the woman had invaded his personal space. He filled with a bubbling rage he needed to let out. Yang Xin Hai ended up in a township named Kanglou on the outskirts of the city. There at night he broke into a home and ended the lives of the 2 men living there. He beat both men to death, then cut their throats. This time he would look for money to take. It was one of his better hauls so far, getting away with the equivalent of $41. Yang Xin Hai next struck in the December of 2001. Staying in Henan, he went to a village in Ye County on the outskirts of the city Pingdingshan, and broke into the home of a couple nearing their 60s. He beat both the man and woman to death, continuing his habit of cutting the victim's throat after. This time there was no trigger, it was purely financially motivated. Once the homeowners were dead, he looked through the house for anything he could take. By the end of 2001, Yang Xin Hai was responsible for the homicides of 12 people, and that figure would rise dramatically throughout 2002. On the 6th of January, the shadow of the monster Yang Xin Hai once again loomed over Zhumadian and now the village of Liuzhuang. In his bloodiest, most vicious attack to date, he used a hammer, which would become his trademark weapon, to beat 5 members of the same family to death. First, attacking the male members of the household before going after the women. Once there were no more signs of life from any of his victims, he violated the youngest of the females. On January 27th, Yang Xin Hai was now in the county of Tongxu, part of Kaifeng, one of China's 8 ancient capital cities. Looking for someone to steal from, he targeted the home of a family of 3. All 3 were beaten to death with the hammer, the female victim being violated post-mortem. The 2 attacks added 8 more to his body count, and it was only the first month of the year. Police in Henan had taken notice of the pattern that had emerged and were in the early stages of connecting the crimes. However, as Yang Xin Hai was living off-grid, it was as if he didn't exist. Something kept him dormant for almost 6 months, but by June 30th he was back in the city of Zhoukou. Walking out of the city into the countryside of Fugou County, Yang Xin Hai was now carrying a walking stick he'd fashioned from a tree to help him traverse the terrain, and for self-defense purposes. When he came upon a village community that looked suitable, he walked around for a while looking for a target that looked promising. He soon spotted a 13-year-old girl who was part of a family of 4. On seeing the girl playing in the village, his evil desires rose. Waiting until nightfall, he entered the home and beat each of the family members to death with the hammer. He then pocketed an amount of money that would be $12 today. The now blood-soaked Yang Xin Hai grabbed his walking stick to leave, but quickly changed his mind when thinking about the 13-year-old. He dropped the stick and went back inside to violate the corpse once more. When the police arrived the next morning to investigate the scene, they found a walking stick with a bloody palm print on it. They noticed that it was cut from a type of tree that didn't grow in the area. This suggested that an outsider had entered the village. They realized they needed to widen the scope of the investigation. The local police reported the crime to the Provincial Public Security Bureau, and the incident was linked to the August 15th incident that took place in Juding. It was the first time the authorities were sure that the same man was responsible, and began checking reports of other similar attacks in Henan. Part of the issue police faced when trying to connect the crimes was a mix of small local police forces under pressure from superiors to solve cases quickly, and villagers using it as an opportunity to cause problems for people they'd had a dispute with. Their search for suspects in each case had focused on people familiar with the areas. In the very first homicides committed by Yang Xin Hai in Guozhuang back in the September of 2000, police arrested a villager soon after the discovery of the bodies. Yang Deli owed the male victim money for some cigarettes, and had a previous arrest and conviction for robbery. Police arrested him with no evidence that he was involved at all, but managed to make the man confess to the crime. At trial he retracted his confession, claiming it was beaten out of him. Fortunately for the innocent man, the courts listened and decided there was really nothing to convict him of the homicides, and he was released. Although it had yet to be connected, in the October 1st case that took place in Enhui, a similar event occurred. Chu Jiku had a number of his pigeons stolen close to the time of the home invasion and homicides. Thinking there may be some connection, he reported the theft to the police. Instead, he fell under suspicion. He had a criminal record for theft, and had some conflict with the female victim. Police felt that the reporting of the stolen pigeons was just a way to put them off his scent. Chu Jiku was arrested, and spent 5 days being deprived of sleep and beaten to get him to confess. The pigeon breeder withstood the harm being done to him, and refused to admit guilt. Without a confession, the police had less than nothing. Hair and semen samples found at the scene didn't match his, so they tried to get him on something else. The police went to search the man's home and found a firearm he used when hunting, but wasn't registered. They charged him with possessing the illegal firearm, and Chu Jiku was sentenced to re-education. He served almost 1 year before the sentence was terminated. On returning to the village, he was treated as guilty by most other residents, and the cloud of suspicion hung over him for years after. While these were the result of local police under pressure for results, in a number of other cases, despite there being no witnesses, there was no shortage of people prepared to name suspects to the police. This was usually due to disputes of money or other village vendettas, who only wanted people they didn't like to be taken away. While police were slowly linking the various assaults and homicides that had taken place, Yang Xin Hai was still on the hunt for victims. On the 21st of July, he was in Dengzhou City, Henan, and in the town of Menglou. At around midnight, he entered the home of a woman who lived alone, and made his way to her bedroom as she slept. His presence caused her to stir awake, and she asked who was in the room. Yang Xin Hai put a knife to her throat, and naked got on top of her. She screamed as he violated her, but her yells went unheard. Once done, the monster got dressed and left, allowing the woman to live. When she reported the assault to police the next day, due to her terror and panic at the time, she mistakenly thought her attacker spoke with a local village accent. This put the police focus on investigating people in the village, rather than looking for an outsider. The mercy Yang Xin Hai showed his victim was calculated. Since the woman lived alone, she was an easy weak target, and if he didn't end her life, he believed there would be less importance placed on the incident by police. Because of this, he stayed in Menglou and searched for more targets. On July 27th, he broke into the home of a family of 4, attracted by their 9-year-old daughter. He exterminated all family members with his hammer. However, this attack marked a change in his behavior. He violated the 35-year-old woman of the home before ending her life, rather than after. He then violated the corpse of the 9-year-old girl, before cutting the throats of each victim to ensure they were dead. Forensic evidence collected at the scene matched with that of other incidents. The police had a DNA profile of Yang Xin Hai, but didn't know who he was or where to start looking. Yang Xin Hai wouldn't be active again until the 21st of October. Back in Zhumadian, and in a village in the township of Songji, he broke into the well-kept home of a man that lived alone. The appearance of the property gave Yang Xin Hai the impression that the owner was well off. His judgment was correct, and he managed to get together a haul of about $420. He didn't attempt to do any harm to the old man and left the home, but he was still feeling somewhat unsatisfied with his evening's work. As midnight fell, he entered the unlocked home of a family he'd seen earlier, while scouting locations in the village. The home was owned by a married couple and their 6-year-old daughter. He beat each of them with the hammer, and violated the young girl post-mortem. The victims were discovered the next day by the father's older brother. However, this time Yang Xin Hai dispensed with cutting his victims' throats. Despite suffering massive head injuries from the hammer blows, the mother survived the assault. Tragically, the child she was pregnant with at the time did not. As police investigated the scene, the usual forensic evidence of hair, saliva and semen was found, but also something else that linked this to the previous case. Since waking the woman he violated but allowed to live, Yang Xin Hai had taken to entering home shoeless, as so to walk around with softer footsteps. Police found a bloody footprint at the scene, which didn't belong to any of the residents, or the older brother who found the bodies. The same bloody footprint had been left at the scene of the previous homicide. Footprints of all residents in a large radius around all neighboring villages were checked, and while police found a couple of close matches, both men with criminal records, it brought the police no closer to the monster. Yang Xin Hai was once again out of sight, sleeping rough in the wilderness. It was as he was sleeping in a field a few days after the last attack, he woke to find the field on fire and a controlled burn by local farmers. If he hadn't woken, he could have easily been consumed by the flames as he slept. This infuriated Yang Xin Hai, who wanted to get revenge on anyone for the incident. He went into the closest village and entered a home. When a man confronted him, Yang Xin Hai beat him about the head with his hammer. He then stole what money he could find, then set the house on fire before leaving. He didn't check to see if he'd ended the life of the homeowner. Fortunately, thanks to other villagers' quick response to the blaze, the injured man survived. On the 7th of November, Yang Xin Hai was still drifting around Zhumadian, this time in the township of Shaodian. The area was more built up than places he'd visited previously, and as he wandered around the town, his fury grew more. He fumed over the fact people were able to live in comfortable homes and eat good food in restaurants, while he felt his own life was that of a stray dog. His self-pitying anger needed somewhere to vent, so he went out into a rural village looking for someone to take it out on. As was the norm, he soon found a target. The home of a family of 4. A mother and father with their 2 young children, 1 a girl. He bludgeoned each of them with the hammer, violated both the female victims, and searched the property for money but was unable to find much of value. Once again, Yang Xin Hai didn't make sure his victims were dead with his knife. He left the young daughter of the family alive, and she would go on to recover from her injuries, albeit with the trauma of what happened. He quickly followed that attack with another only a week later. On November 16th, and on returning to Kaifeng and heading to a village in the county of Weishi, he took the lives of a grandmother in her 60s, and her 14-year-old granddaughter, violating the girl after. 3 days later, on November 19th, he returned to the city of Luohe, and found himself in a village in Wangmeng Township. There he attacked and ended the lives of an elderly couple and stole the equivalent of $97. With the attacks coming more frequently, the police response ramped up significantly. Males in cities and townships across Henan were having their fingerprints taken and being told to give blood samples, but Yang Xin Hai was mostly out of reach. Unbeknownst to them, the police had the man they were looking for in custody on at least 2 occasions. Once, shortly after one of his attacks, he was spotted walking the streets of a neighboring town by patrol police. Looking at the dirty, scruffy man in front of them, they suspected he could be a thief and took him in for questioning. Knowing that if he lied about his name, that would put him under further suspicion, Yang Xin Hai truthfully gave them his identity and home address. While being held, he heard conversations about the last crime he had committed. Police openly talked about the investigation, not realizing the man they were looking for was sat with them listening in. The officers seemed to have forgotten Yang Xin Hai until he started asking questions. Annoyed by what they considered a vagrant, police told him to mind his own business and soon kicked him out of the station. Yang Xin Hai had the gall to ask if he could share some of the noodles the officers were eating. His request was dismissed and he was back out on the streets. The second occasion was when he was found by police sleeping in an abandoned farmhouse. He was using the building to try and get some shelter from the cold winter. He was actually happy to be taken into a warm police station for the evening. Again, he gave his real name and home address. The following morning, several women were brought into the station to take a look at him. Yang Xin Hai wasn't told why the women were brought in to identify him, but he wasn't worried. At that time, none of his victims had survived. The women all said they didn't know him, and once again Yang Xin Hai was released. On the 1st of December 2002, Yang Xin Hai had returned to the city of Zhoukou and was in the village of Yanwan. He forced his way into the home of a family of three, once again a married couple and their young daughter. Both parents were bludgeoned to death. Their daughter was beaten with a hammer, then violated. Before leaving, Yang Xin Hai helped himself to the $400 he found. When the scene was discovered the next morning by their adult son, his parents were dead, but his younger sister still alive, albeit suffering from critical head injuries. After hospital treatment, the girl survived the attack. A special task force had been created and the various incidents around the province had been linked by forensic evidence. Investigators knew they were looking for one person for the series, but still had no idea who they were looking for. They had DNA evidence from various crime scenes, fingerprints, footprints, but crucially no eyewitness descriptions. The few surviving victims of Yang Xin Hai were unable to give a description of the person who tried to end their lives. They were attacked in the dark, either being woken by the sounds of their family members being bludgeoned, or hit while they were sleeping. The next attack would happen in a new city in Henan. On December 13th, in Yanning County in the city of Xuchang, Yang Xin Hai attacked a married couple and their young son. He beat the adults first, then moved on to the child. As he was bringing the hammer down onto the son's head, the father surprised the monster when he tried to get up and stop him. The father's attempts to save his family were in vain, and Yang Xin Hai left the home with all family members dead. He needed to steal a change of clothes as his own had been soaked in blood. Only 2 days later he struck again, although now he'd left Henan and returned to the city of Fuyang in the town of Micha in Anhui. The home Yang Xin Hai targeted was that of a single father raising his 9-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter. The man's wife had passed away some years before. All three were beaten to death, and the daughter was then violated. The bodies were discovered 2 days later by relatives. Strands of hair found on the daughter confirmed that this was done by the same person responsible for the Henan attacks. However, the police again were behind Yang Xin Hai as he left Anhui and returned to Henan. His body count now standing at 46. This attack marked his last of the year, but it wouldn't be long into 2003 when the monster became active again. As the 2003 Chinese New Year got underway, the task force began a campaign to publicize the case more. A reward of 100,000 RMB, around $14,000, was offered for information leading to an arrest. The police released a profile criminal psychologists had put together of the suspect. It stated they were looking for a male aged between 25 and 40, between 1.60 m and 1.67 m in height, and of a thin build. They added that the suspect was familiar with rural life, and that he was likely homeless and that he would have a previous criminal record. The vague profile hindered more than it helped. It would see small police forces in various townships receive hundreds of calls with people suggesting names. As police did what they could to look at any promising suggestions, none brought them closer to Yang Xin Hai. The 2003 Spring Festival brought both potential benefits and drawbacks for the activities of the monster. As people returned home from other provinces to spend the new year with their families, it meant homes would have more cash lying around for him to take, But it also meant that there was a lot more human activity taking place in the villages, and more chance he'd be discovered. He apparently stayed quiet until early February. He tried to break into and steal from a number of homes in villages, but was interrupted by residents and chased off, disappearing into the snowy countryside. He managed to get away with a few hundred RMB, but it wasn't enough to satisfy him. He needed more than just money. On the 5th of February, in Xiangcheng, a county in the city of Pingdingshan, now back in Henan. At around 3 in the morning, Yang Xin Hai entered the home of a married couple and their 2 children, a son and daughter. The mother, father and son were all bludgeoned to death. The daughter was beaten and violated. The next morning, as firecrackers rung in the new year in the village, and the family didn't appear, concerned villagers went to check. Relatives found the 3 dead bodies, but the daughter had survived and was still breathing. She would live after treatment in hospital. The attack fulfilled Yang Xin Hai, and for the next few days he decided to get out of the cold snow-laden countryside and use the money he'd stolen to stay in a small, cheap guest house. Although he'd long since lost, or dispensed with his identity card, the type of places he chose to stay didn't worry too much about the laws for registering guests. Their clientele were usually people who were trying to avoid too much attention, and rooms generally charged by the hour. The relative comfort he lived in for those days still couldn't prevent his desires from rising up, and soon enough he returned to Zhoukou and went on the hunt for his next victims. Now at a village in the county of Xihua, on the 18th of February, Yang Xin Hai entered the home of 2 girls aged 10 and 13 and their parents. All 4 members of the family were violently exterminated, the 2 sisters both violated post-mortem. The bodies of the victims were found 4 days after their deaths. The following month he would commit his final crime in Henan. Since the police had been widely publicizing the case more, he had seen notices of the profile the task force had created being posted in various towns and cities in the province. And while the profile fit him well, there was also nothing that identified him specifically. So while he wasn't especially concerned about being arrested, he still felt it more prudent for him to go to a new area. On the 23rd of March, in the town of Chengguan, in the city of Kaifeng, Yang Xin Hai attacked and ended the lives of 4 members of a family, the parents and their 2 young sons. He violated the mother post-mortem. The 5th member of the family and his main target, a young daughter, was fortunate enough to be staying with her grandfather at the time and so became her family's last surviving member. His spree in Henan alone covered 7 cities around the province, most with multiple incidents which had each taken place in different townships, leaving 51 people dead. This isn't including the 2 attacks in Anhui. After this, Yang Xin Hai headed northwest into the neighboring province of Shandong and to the city of Heze, only 128 kilometers away from Kaifeng. Yang Xin Hai had grown up in extreme poverty, and as a result even relatively small amounts of money could make him feel like he was wealthy. However, he spent the money he stole soon after taking it. He was especially fond of spending it in establishments such as bathhouses, spas, barbers and massage parlors where women working there offered special services. In the poorer Henan, he rarely had to pay more than 100 RMB for the extras on offer. In the relatively more prosperous Shandong, he discovered things were different. In a massage parlor in Heze, he demanded full service from the girl he picked out. The woman felt he was too rustic and looked like a dirty vagrant. She told him she was only prepared to offer him hand relief. Although angered and wanting to attack her, he accepted. When time came to pay, he handed over 100 RMB, only to be told the service cost 180. Feeling like he was being cheated, he tried to dispute the price, but the woman, with little time for his arguments, told him to speak to her boss if he had a problem. Furious at feeling bullied, Yang Xin Hai begrudgingly handed over the extra 80 and made up his mind to take revenge, but it wouldn't be against the people he felt wronged him. On April 2nd, in the town of Taoyuan, he took his revenge on the Heze massage parlor by beating to death a couple that had been married only 100 days. The wife was violated after death and was 3 months pregnant at the time. At first, police in Shandong, not fully aware of the assaults that had taken place in Henan, suspected this was committed by local gangsters. Once the task force in Henan was made aware of the incident, they compared the forensic evidence at the scene, and it was added to the list of crimes perpetrated by Yang Xin Hai. The response of the police in Shandong was somewhat more robust than that of the forces in the various cities and towns in Henan. The police in Heze came out in force, checking all people registered in hotels and guest houses, and checkpoints were set up at transport hubs and major roads in the search for the suspect. Then another event hit China that forced Yang Xin Hai to lie low for a period of time. The SARS outbreak hit hard and was rapidly spreading around China. Interprovincial travel was severely restricted, and non-local residents were subject to much more stringent checks. To avoid being caught out by this, Yang Xin Hai decided it was better to head back to his home city, Zhumadian, until things eased off. Although he was back in his hometown, he made no attempt to visit his family. He continued to sleep outside, often at bus or train stations, and spent the days drifting around the countryside on the edges of the city. Towards the end of July, the SARS panic was dying down and restrictions were being lifted. During the health crisis, the search for the monster hadn't been forgotten by police, and they were still posting their profile of the suspect around cities and towns. Yang Xin Hai took the opportunity to leave Henan once the restrictions were eased. He headed north to another neighboring province, Hebei. He arrived in the city of Xingtai sometime in early August, and quickly found a target in a village called Lidao. There he broke into 2 different homes, stealing money from one. The other he couldn't find any cash, but decided to take a hammer he could put to use. Sneaking round the home, he also saw a young girl sleeping alone. His bloodlust rose on seeing an easy target, but it was close to dawn, and he felt there was more risk of him being caught, so he decided it could wait. He left the home and hid the hammer in a nearby haystack ready for when he returned. On August 5th, he came back into the village, but found that the hammer had gone. He searched for another weapon and came across an axe in one of the home's front yards. He took the axe and headed to the home where he'd seen the girl sleeping. Hacking at them with the axe, he slaughtered the young girl and her parents as they slept after breaking into the home. The 15-year-old daughter was then assaulted after the violent attack. Only days later, on August 8th, in Jiazhuang, he visited a massage parlor for the special services, but the woman serving him demanded he wear a condom. Yang Xin Hai tried to refuse, which caused the woman to insult him, saying he was a low-class peasant. Again he was filled with fury, but didn't dare do anything. He would vent his anger later on people unconnected to the incident. In a village on the outskirts of the city, he saw 2 young girls playing outside. He had his target and waited till night. The 2 young girls were part of a family of 5. With a newly bought hammer, Yang Xin Hai annihilated the entire family, violating the 2 young girls after their deaths. He then searched the house for money, but the anger and humiliation he felt at the massage parlor came back to him. He decided to take revenge for his perceived humiliation at the massage parlor by mutilating parts of the anatomy of the female victims. Police investigating both crimes in Hebei were quick to inform officers in Henan, suggesting that both attacks followed the same pattern as the other incidents. The task force convened with their counterparts in Hebei, and details of the man they were looking for were spread around the province. Looking at previous patterns, they were confident the man they were looking for would head to another city. Any locations popular with floating populations were given the profiles of the person to be on the lookout for. The added pressure appeared to have a positive effect. There would be no more attacks by Yang Xin Hai in the subsequent months, but they were still no closer to finding out who the monster they were looking for was. On the 2nd of November 2003, police in the Hebei city of Cangzhou, over 200 kilometers from Sijiazhuang, received a call about a suspicious person staying at a cheap hostel in the city. 2 officers were dispatched to investigate. The guest in question fit the physical description of the suspect, had no identity card when registering to stay, and crucially had a Henan accent. The person of interest was staying in room 205. The officers went to the hotel in plain clothes and acted as if they were also guests. Thinking up some reason to knock on the door of 205, they tried to get a look at the resident, but there was no answer. They got themselves booked into the room opposite so they could observe the person in the room when he left. It took until the next morning for the suspect to finally leave the room when he went out for breakfast. The officers tailed the suspect as he walked aimlessly through the city, at one point loitering outside a local primary school. The suspect then led them to a street known for being a red light district. The man went into a massage parlor which offered special extras, and had just given the police following him a reason to detain him. Noticing the men following him inside, the suspect panicked and quickly made his way out of a back door to escape. The police gave chase and easily caught up to the man. They arrested him and searched him, the suspect remaining calm throughout. He was only carrying a fruit knife and 500 RMB cash. At the police station, the man gave his name as Yang Xin Hai, told police his hometown, and seemed completely unconcerned about his arrest. In the mind of Yang Xin Hai, he hadn't yet committed a major crime in Changzhou, and so was only being arrested for trying to solicit special services. Due to his past experiences of being detained, he had no issue telling police the truth about his identity, and was friendly and relaxed. Yang Xin Hai waited patiently, expecting that at the most he would be held for 24 hours before being released with a warning or at most a fine. The police in Changzhou got in touch with counterparts on the task force, and a team made their way to the city. As he waited, doctors entered the interrogation room and took blood samples from a relaxed Yang Xin Hai. Not being knowledgeable about forensics, in his mind he hadn't left any of his blood at any scenes, so their taking blood was unconnected to the crimes he'd committed. Preliminary analysis of the blood showed it was type B, which matched the forensic profile found at the scenes of the crimes in Henan, Anhui, Shandong, and Hebei. Without being given a reason why, police re-entered the interrogation room in force and shackled the ankles and hands of Yang Xin Hai, who remained unmoved. As members of the task force arrived at the station, they entered the interrogation room and fixed their eyes on the man in front of them. He was asked point-blank if he knew anything about the series of homicides in the 4 provinces. Yang Xin Hai denied having any involvement. When he was shown the forensic profile and told it was 99% accurate, the monster replied that if it was only 99%, then he was the 1%. After hours of questioning and being shown the evidence against him, interrogators asked how he could deny he was responsible. Yang Xin Hai began to crack but remained defiant. He told police that he couldn't have left hair at every scene, and that if they had evidence he would confess, if not then they should stop trying to scare him. As they began to get some admission of guilt from the man in front of them, police wanted to know what created the monster set before them. To get a full picture of who the man responsible for the deaths of at least 67 people was. Yang Xin Hai was born on the 17th of July 1968, and was a native of Henan province, once one of the poorest regions in the country. He grew up in Zhengyang, a county belonging to the city of Zhumaide, in a tiny village of only 200 households. Living in poverty was simply a way of life for most people in China at that time, but even compared to that, the poverty suffered by the family of Yang Xin Hai was extreme. His childhood home, built by his father, was walls made of soil and a roof made of thatched wheat. His farmer parents had 2 oxen, who were so vital to their survival were fed better than the family, and at night lived inside the home. One of 6 siblings, Yang Xin Hai spent his childhood living in a home that was filled with the dung and urine of the animals. His brothers and sisters all worked the fields with their parents so that the family could get enough food rations from the local government, just to eat a small amount of rice and some vegetables. The young Yang Xin Hai wanted to change his conditions. When only 8 years old, he demanded that his parents send him to school, something they hadn't done with his siblings. Despite barely being able to afford the education, his father was willing to allow his son to try. Yang Xin Hai did surprisingly well in an entrance exam and was admitted into a 2nd grade class. While he worked hard on his learning, school life wasn't easy for the young boy. He was ostracized by his classmates, who while poor were not as poverty-stricken as him. Due to his lack of nutrition, he was physically underdeveloped and was the target of frequent bullying. This led him to sit alone in his classroom or hiding in the toilets when there were breaks between classes. When he was 11 years old, he returned home to find his mother crying. His father had attempted to end his own life by drinking pesticide. One of his brothers had been caught stealing rapeseed flowers from the village cadres. As a result, the family would face having to pay a hefty fine for this, which the family could ill afford. The young Yang Xin Hai struggled to understand why his family were being punished so harshly for something young children in the village did frequently while out playing. His father recovered after a time, but his young son began to develop a feeling of inferiority and a resentment of the society around him. Regardless, he continued to perform well in school, showing some budding talent in art and literature. He managed to get accepted into a decent high school and seemed to have promise. However, his poverty was still a cloud over him. His school had a canteen, serving food Yang Xin Hai had never been able to taste in his life. His peers would eat lunch and dinner there, but Yang Xin Hai couldn't afford it. If he wanted to eat, he'd have to make the 6-kilometer round trip to his home for what little his parents could prepare. He would occasionally stay with a cousin who lived closer to the school and had a reasonably successful business. But, while they allowed him to stay in their home, they would still force him to pay for any food he ate. In 1985, the young Yang Xin Hai vanished. He gave no word to his teachers or family. He walked out of the school one day and never returned. It turned out he'd gone to find work in a coal mine. He gave up on education when he saw how much his parents struggled to pay for his tuition fees, and came to believe that even if he got accepted into a college it would be too much for them to afford, so he was wasting his time. He spent the next years drifting around the region picking up different jobs, ones that were physically demanding but required no qualifications. He struggled with the physical labor, still being somewhat underdeveloped, and didn't see the point of working so hard for such little reward, especially when bosses would make up reasons not to pay employees for their labor. He then began to notice that those engaged in illegal activities seemed to live a better, easier life than those doing honest work. He took to stealing, often from construction sites, and selling on what he stole. He would pickpocket people around transport hubs and other busy areas in towns and cities, but was caught by police on a number of occasions. Sometimes the amounts he stole were small enough for him to receive a warning or fine. Sometimes he would do stints inside re-education camps. It had been 5 years since he had been back to his hometown, and didn't intend to go back to visit his family until a chance meeting on a bus. Recently released from a re-education center in Hebei, Yang Xin Hai was recognized by someone from the same village. He told Yang Xin Hai that his parents missed him, and that a girl he once essentially agreed to marry was still waiting for his return. It was especially common in the past for families in Chinese villages to arrange marriages between their offspring. Around the time he was in junior high, Yang Xin Hai and a classmate of his had essentially been chosen to marry when they were of age. Due to his performance in school, the young Yang Xin Hai was viewed by the girl's family as a good potential husband. On hearing the girl was still waiting for his return, he agreed to go back. His only other relationship he'd had with a woman, apart from nights he'd paid for, was with the landlady of a room he was renting, who was 10 years his senior. It ended badly when she discovered Yang Xin Hai with a woman he'd paid for in his room and threw him out. Going back to his village, he had little interest in spending any time with his family. Little had changed apart from the thatched ceiling now black with smoke and dripping grease from the cooking his family did. However, any excitement he felt towards meeting his future wife soon turned to feelings of humiliation and betrayal. It was the spring festival, and the woman he'd come back for had married only days after his return. This left him feeling that once again the people of the village were bullying him. He believed the villager he'd met on the bus lied, just to make him lose face in front of his family and the village. He stayed at home for a time after his perceived humiliation, taking a job in a brick kiln, but soon left once more without saying a word. This time he headed south to Guangdong, a province that was attractive to migrant workers given the industrialization and the numerous jobs in factories on offer. However, there were strict controls over the migrant worker population. Even just leaving their factory premises without their identity cards would see workers arrested and held in detention centers. If people were discovered with the so-called 3 no's, which meant no registration, no work unit and no accommodation, then they would be placed into special holding units until a family member could come with the necessary paperwork to prove their identity. Yang Xin Hai fell foul of the regulations and wrote a letter to his father, asking him to come and get him out. More than willing to help his son, his father made the 1,300-kilometer journey south and got him released. His father begged him to come back home, but Yang Xin Hai refused, saying he was better off by himself. In the years after leaving Guangdong, he drifted around various provinces stealing to get by and make some kind of living. He decided that committing his acts of theft in more prosperous cities carried with it too much possibility of being caught and returned to prison, so he decided to target rural areas. There was virtually no police presence in villages, and the homes were easy to get into, often just having to use a knife to lift up door latches. Around 1995 he returned to Henan in the city of Xinyang, around 100 kilometers from Zhumadian. He drifted around villages stealing whatever he could. Sometimes money, sometimes the farm produce of villagers, which he would sell at very low prices to get rid of it quickly. It was in this year that Yang Xin Hai first attempted a more serious crime. He attacked a woman who was walking alone on a quiet country back road. He tore the clothes off his victim and attempted to force himself on her. The woman fought back and sunk her teeth deep into the flesh of his face. The pain forced Yang Xin Hai to back off and the woman escaped unharmed. The attempted assault was reported to the police, and a short time later, caught in the middle of a robbery, police noticed the still not fully healed wounds on the face of Yang Xin Hai. He was arrested and later identified by the woman he attacked. The attempted assault had taken place in his home county of Zhengyang, and when in court to face sentencing for the assault and robbery, Yang Xin Hai recognized the presiding judge as a villager from his hometown. He believed this would see him treated more leniently. He was wrong, and was sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. After the sentence was handed down, he met with the judge and pleaded to be sent to a detention center rather than a labor camp. The judge told him there were 3 requirements for that. First, the sentence needed to be short, the crime non-violent, and the guilty suffering from an illness or disability. As he didn't meet any of those requirements, there was nothing the judge could do to help him. Yang Xin Hai didn't believe his fellow villager. He felt if his family had more money or better status in the village, he would have been treated better. He was sent to the labor camp, where he spent his time breaking rocks with a hammer. And while he struggled with the physical labor, smashing rocks with a hammer all day would help him develop skills he would put to much more violent use in the future. He was released from the labor camp on the 31st of May 1999. During his time inside, the only family member to visit him was a single time his father came to bring him some hometown food. Despite the number of times he walked away from his own family, he felt bitterness towards them for not showing enough concern about him. Having his freedom back, Yang Xin Hai had no intention of turning his life around and changing his ways. He soon returned to drifting through the countryside, committing petty acts of theft as he wandered from village to village. On one occasion, he entered a home where the front door was left open. He found a woman sleeping alone. As he slid into the bed with her, the woman first assumed that it was her husband returning home from the fields. She soon realized she was wrong when Yang Xin Hai began to violate her. The woman was too terrified to scream or fight back. Once he'd finished, Yang Xin Hai left the home and stole a bicycle that was in the front yard and moved on to the next village. In the winter of 1999, he would attack again, this time with a raised level of violence. At night, he entered a home where he'd seen an old woman living with what he assumed was her granddaughter. He attacked the older woman with a stick, knocking her unconscious before binding her hands with some rope. He then struck the young girl in the head, knocking her to the ground. As she was trying to recover, Yang Xin Hai pounced on the terrified child and kissed her. The girl fiercely resisted and bit hard into her attacker's tongue, tearing a chunk of it off. Yang Xin Hai struck the girl in the head again, knocking her unconscious, but was in so much pain and bleeding heavily from the mouth he needed to leave, and was unable to finish his assault. He stole 4 RMB the girl had in her pocket, and made sure to pick up the piece of his tongue she'd spat out after tearing it off, which he disposed of in a nearby river. Due to his past experience of being caught out by the bite of a victim, he didn't dare go to a hospital for treatment, or even enter a pharmacy for medication. He dealt with his tongue himself, using raw egg whites to try and remedy the inflammation and pain. During his time trying to recover, he could barely speak or eat, and the injury had a lasting effect on his speech. By August of the year 2000, he'd sufficiently recovered to resume his criminal activity. In a village on the outskirts of the city Anyang, he selected the home of a married couple. He entered at night and knocked the husband unconscious before binding his hands. The wife screamed at Yang Xin Hai that they didn't keep any money in the home. He attacked the wife, knocking her out and tying her hands together. He then violated his unconscious victim. Both the man and woman would survive the assault, suffering only fairly minor injuries. In his next attack in September, he would leave no survivors and truly become the monster of the Central Plains.
死吧，不死，反正命都到这儿了，不死，你看这么多人，石家庄杀人强奸，听了吗？知道了吗？石家庄杀人强奸，5条人命，差不多是。
恐怕还有吧？
有啊，我给你说吧。
接着说。
一个我给你不好吧，现在3条人命。
Despite his early reluctance to confess to his crimes, as he was confronted with more evidence, almost impressed by the work the police had put into the investigation, Yang Xin Hai began to admit his guilt. And once he started talking, he wouldn't stop. The confession went on for hours, claiming his motivations were money, to violate women, and revenge. When asked if he felt any remorse for any of his victims, he replied that he didn't ever think about them. He didn't attempt to make any justification as to why he ended their lives. He was also asked about what impact he thought his crimes had on society, to which he replied society had nothing to do with him.
可能的主要动机还是为了，可能一个是为了钱，主要的还是一种报复心理。
什么报复心理？
就是强奸。
报复哪一方面？
当然是女人嘛。
报复对象？
女人嘛。说我在杀人的时候，我只是感觉到自己有一种那个心中一种欲念，处此乐趣，是这样。至于杀人，他们该不该死，那都不是我关心的问题。我也不和社会，我好像脱离社会模式，我不关于社会上，我不给人那社会对我怎么样。
Yang Xin Hai was charged for 23 different cases and 67 intentional homicides, although he later stated he ended the lives of more than 70 people. While during his interrogation, there was a brief moment where he seemed to show some remorse for what he did, almost breaking down into tears. That glimmer of humanity didn't last long. On the 12th of November 2003, he was transferred to a detention center to await his trial as investigators further looked into his case. While detained, he was under constant watch by armed guards, and had his legs and arms shackled with chains weighing 20 kilos at all times, except when eating or sleeping. He requested the opportunity to write a memoir of his crimes, so that it could be studied by criminal psychologists, but he was refused access to any writing implements. Other inmates in the jail were especially wary of him. They knew who he was and what he was accused of, and many gave him a wide berth. Yang Xin Hai seemed to revel in his notoriety. It may have been through fear, rather than the respect he believed he deserved all his life, but he felt people no longer looked down at him. Former cellmates of his would later say how Yang Xin Hai would happily go into detail about the crimes he committed, paying special focus of his violations of his female victims. The only thing he wouldn't talk about was why he usually violated them after death. On the 1st of February 2004, the monster Yang Xin Hai faced trial. On seeing the large number of armed officers there to escort him, he smiled and praised the work they were doing. According to the officers with him, he laughed and joked on the journey to the court and was impressed by the level of security around him. He faced hours of questioning by the presiding judges, and was able to go through the circumstance of each charge with detail. After starting at around 7:20 in the morning, at 7:30 in the evening, Yang Xin Hai was found guilty of all charges and handed the death sentence. He was informed he had 10 days to appeal the sentence, but responded that there was no need, he wasn't going to dispute the judgment. When asked if he wanted to see any of his family before the sentence was carried out, he gave a simple and stern no in reply. On the 14th of February 2004, Yang Xin Hai was executed by gunshot. His final words were, "I deserve it, it is unreasonable to kill so many and let me live." After his execution, the family of Yang Xin Hai, out of shame, refused to claim the cremated remains of their son and brother, who became one of the most prolific and feared monsters in the modern history of the country. With at least 67 bodies, numerous women and girls violated, and multiple generations of families annihilated, the damage done by the nihilistic crime spree of the monster was felt long after his conviction and execution. The few surviving victims had to deal with the pain and distress of what they went through, and losing the people closest to them. The small, close-knit village communities, where many people would have been in some way related to the victims, were left traumatized for years after. The two men who were falsely accused by police, Yang Deli and Chu Jiku, were essentially ostracized and treated with fear and suspicion by their communities, even after Yang Xin Hai confessed his guilt. His parents were left devastated by the actions of the monster. In interviews, his father spoke of how he couldn't understand what happened. They told reporters he was an honest, hard-working boy as a child, too squeamish to even slaughter a chicken on the farm. In one interview, the father took the blame for the devastation his son caused to so many people, saying, "I am a sinner to have produced a child like that. I hope in my next life I will do better." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.